Degrowth, I think many people see as the opposite of growth. And growth, if you read the newspapers, you read about growth, or you hear politicians talk about growth, then they mean always growth in GDP or GDP per capita. What is GDP? Well, in English, gross domestic product. It's the value added of all the products and services we produce in the market economy in a country. Now, some people think that should grow, and others think it's not important. I belong to the latter group. I think it's not important. Here there are people who think that it might better go down. So we should not have a growth, but a decline in GDP, in national income. I'm not one of the people who believes we need to go that far, but I think we should not pay any serious attention to GDP, because it's a bad indicator of social welfare. A higher GDP doesn't mean that we are happier as a society, doesn't mean we solve important problems. For very poor countries it could be true that there is a high correlation between improvements in human conditions and income increases. But for rich countries it doesn't hold any longer. There's a lot of evidence in the scientific literature now that shows that we have reached a level of income beyond which more income doesn't make people happier, may even make people less happy, because they have to give up something which is more important, like scarce resources, clean air, community, relationships, leisure time. People work extremely hard. We are willing to work so hard to have a financial income, to spend it on things that we have 10 times already. Now, what I've discovered is that a lot of my fellow economists agree with me to this point. They say, well, GDP is not a good indicator indeed, but they're not willing to give up GDP in the end. And that's a kind of a paradox, and that interests me. Why is that the case? My explanation is twofold. First of all, that economists say, well, GDP doesn't have such a big impact on reality. Is that true? I think it's not true. If you look at the current crisis, when it started, we were bombarded with information about GDP. GDP was going very badly, and as a result, the expectations were also negative. Everybody said, GDP is going bad. We should not invest, we should not buy, let's be careful, which just reinforced the crisis. Now that in some countries, not all countries, in some countries things are going better, we get the opposite information. GDP is going well, everything is going well. So GDP is having a lot of impact on the decisions and the expectations of people. Politicians also don't want to be against GDP growth, because that's something that doesn't sell well in times of election. So I think there is still a lot of concern about GDP growth, even though science, economics in particular, has shown very clearly that it's not a good indicator, a relevant indicator. This is a very undesirable situation. And there's no easy solution for this, but I think good economists should be honest and say GDP is not a good indicator. Whenever someone implicitly or explicitly makes a statement that says GDP growth is useful, is desirable, someone else should stop him or her and at that moment say, sorry, do you agree that GDP is not a good indicator? Okay, then why don't you draw the conclusion?